I don't really need to, go through all of the formal accolades. He is at the Brookings Institution now, and his bio is in your program. But I want to take a second and tell you the first time I met Ron. And it was 1999. He doesn't remember this, I'm sure. But it was 1999, and I was a new doctoral student at Princeton. And I was taking a class with Elizabeth Donahue on welfare reform. In 1999, it was still called welfare reform. Today, 20 years later, it's just called welfare. And she was at the National Women's Law Center during the time of the bill being developed. And she was really instrumental in working with Ron on the child care portion of the bill that many folks thought was really a strong portion of the bill. And she said in class, next week we're going to have a special guest speaker, Ron Haskins. And I thought, what? I couldn't believe this. And I knew Ron's name because prior to that, I had been at the Kennedy School for 2 years, 97 through 99. And for those of you who were kind of around then, that was a time period in which we had just signed welfare reform in August of 1996. And there were several folks back at the Kennedy School who had left the the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration kind of in protest of this signing. And it is hard to overstate the doom that was predicted at the Kennedy School. The weekly folks coming in saying, this is it. We have killed poor people. There will be 1 million kids sleeping on the streets. It was really dire predictions. And Ron Haskins was to blame. And so, so the fact that this man was going to come in to my classroom, I was pregnant. I thought, oh man, this is going to hurt my baby. What's going to go on? So, and then in walks this white-haired man and sits down. And Elizabeth starts to introduce him and tells us that he has his PhD in child development and talks about all the work that he's done. And then he starts to talk, and I realize, wait, he's not quite as evil as I think that he should be. He actually is very reasoned and has really good points. I may not agree with many of the things he had to say. At that time, I was deep in my militancy about saving the poor. But he certainly came from a point of evidence, not ideology, and truly cared about making the lives of family and children better. So I came to appreciate him as a professional, and in the last 15 years or so have come to really appreciate being able to work with him in multiple ways. And so I'm really glad that you're here. Thank you for coming, and I'm excited to hear more about what you have to say today.
Thank you. Well, I think that was a good introduction. I'm not exactly sure.
Did I spend enough time on the good stuff?
I was once introduced by another liberal as Darth Vader.
Oh.
But I think the idea that a pregnant woman was afraid that by listening to me would harm her baby is even beyond Darth Vader.
I'm sorry,
So,
that might have gone too far.
I hope my wife never finds out that another woman was afraid that just listen to me talk would harm the baby. The rest of the introduction is pretty good, though. But as you're about to learn, I specialize in overcoming fine introductions, so it usually takes me 2 or 3 minutes. So, I went to Washington in 1985 for 1 year. I was on a fellowship from the Association for the Advancement of Science, American Association for Advancement of Science. And my goal, I was coming from University of North Carolina, where I worked on the Abstinence Project. I had a chance to harm lots of babies in the Abstinence Project. And I was going to be there for 1 year, and I was going to study the use of social science evidence in social policy formulation, and go back to UNC and write the definitive book on the use of social science evidence and how it could shape up public policy. I'm still in Washington after however many years. I don't want to think too much about it. It's been since 1985. And of course, I had never written that book. I got absolutely swept away by Washington and decided to stay. There were some interesting jobs, and I took one of them with the Ways and Means Committee, and I stayed there for 14 years, and then I went to Brookings because I wanted to write a book about welfare reform, which I did, mainly to justify myself with all the pregnant women in the country, you know, that I wasn't totally evil. But it was a great story about how the bill passed. In fact, someplace this afternoon at 4 o'clock, we're going to have a session about it. So if any of you can make that, that would be very interesting. And I will begin by refuting people like Cynthia, who saw this bill as evil. And believe me, she did not exaggerate. You cannot believe the stuff that was said on the floor of the House and the Senate. Senator Moynihan, who's a great hero of mine, and interestingly had written a report, as many of you probably know, on black families in 1965 that got exactly the same kind of treatment, that the world was coming to an end, if babies were going to die and so forth. And Moynihan said on the floor of the Senate that if this bill passes, that in New York City they will have wagons that go around on winter mornings and pick up the frozen dead babies. Moynihan said that. And there were many similar things. The Nation magazine that many of you may know about, which is probably one of the most respected and respected by people in the center and on the left, but on the right it's vilified. The Nation had an article that went way beyond where Cynthia did about babies dying and everything. So anyway, I enjoyed my years with the Ways and Means Committee. I wanted to write this book, so I went to Brookings. And when I got to Brookings in 2000, I was asked to talk to the trustees of Brookings about what I learned in 14 years in Congress. And to try to capture it, I had I almost brought it today, but I'm a little sick of using it now, so I didn't bring it, but it's a pie chart. And it shows all the factors that influence policy. So, and things that normal people would not think of, like committee chairmen have a big part of the pie because they are really, if the chairman wants to do something, no one can stop him. Maybe the Speaker in the House and maybe the Majority Leader in the Senate, but even they are not guaranteed they can stop him. So here are all these things, and there's one little teeny, you can barely see it labeled evidence. And that was really, I think, in many cases that is true. Evidence does not play much of a role. So now, flash forward many years, we are working on the way when I remember first meeting you was with the Future Children Journal, which is a journal that Brookings publishes in conjunction with Princeton, and Cynthia was at Princeton. And we publish 2 a year, all about children's issue. Every issue is devoted to a particular, it has a theme, so it's a particular issue. And we did an issue on, roughly speaking, preschool programs. Every time we do an issue, we release it at Brookings. We have an event. I write a 3,000-word policy brief, usually in conjunction with people who are in the journal. And in this journal, there was one of the papers focused on home visiting programs. Very nice paper. And so I was really interested in home visiting. I try to pick a topic that has some application in Washington. So I usually try to find something that's being considered by the legislature. Well, it turned out I vaguely knew that the administration was implementing a home visiting program, and I knew a little bit about the background. It actually started during the presidential campaign that Obama had brought it up. And so I got fairly deeply into this and learned the whole story about the home visiting evidence-based initiative. And I wrote the brief. It was called Social Science Rising, because this was a case where my chart was really inaccurate. Evidence was really important in the home visiting, both in negative and positive ways. But so after I wrote it, a person that I knew at the Office of Management and Budget, named Kathy Stack, called me up, and she said, "Ron, I read your brief. It's very good, but you don't know the half of it. Let's have lunch." And so we had lunch, and she proceeded to lay out for me the various initiatives that the Obama administration was in the midst of. And by the way, I won't talk about this anymore, but they were also, I follow Head Start pretty closely, and they were doing something very similar in Head Start. So I had a rough idea about what they were doing. But I was furiously taking, no question, I broke my record for taking notes at a lunch with one person. She talked and I wrote. And when we got through, I said, you know what? Her last line was something like, people should know more about this. And I said, you are right, and I'll tell you what, I'm going to get some money, and I'm going to write a book about this. And so that's what I did. The Grant Foundation, which is a foundation that loves evidence and really interested in promoting the uses of evidence and learning more about the kind of evidence that has the most impact, et cetera, et cetera. And they gave me some money. I hired a research assistant who turned out to be roughly 3 times smarter than I am, a guy named Greg Margolis. He did all the work, and I got all the credit. That's the way it's supposed to work. I was pretty happy with that. We interviewed 134 people on the Hill, in the administration, advocates, a couple of scholars, as few as possible. And then we reviewed the record, a fair number of newspaper articles, but not as many as I anticipated, but a lot of congressional records. But again, not as many as you would expect, because a lot of these things passed on the quiet. I'll talk about that more in a few minutes. The administration was not anxious to call attention to them because they intended to stuff them in big bills where people wouldn't notice and pass it. And that strategy was very successful. So we found out a lot about these initiatives and what people thought about it, what the congressional staffers thought about it, and what people in the administration thought about it. Fascinating story. So now I'm going to tell you that story if I can figure out how to press one button. Let's see. All right. So first, as it was originally conceived, and I think there was a certain amount, it wasn't like they wrote it down and here's the proposal, here's the whole plan. It took on a life of its own. But the vision was, and Peter Orszag, who was the head of OMB, and I could not exaggerate to you how much influence the head of OMB has. The president of the university is a piker compared to the head of OMB. Because OMB advises the president, they have tremendous impact on the budget, and especially a powerful guy like Peter Orszag. And Orszag is a fanatic about evidence. He conducted random assignment experiments himself. So Orszag was a perfect guy to head this up. I'll come back to this later, but there were people everywhere in the administration with backgrounds in research. So you could take half the faculty of the LBJ school and put them in the administration. That's what they had, the people with a lot of experience and knew about research. All right, so they wanted to do 2 things. They wanted to spend most federal grant dollars. I might have skipped over something here. Okay. They wanted to spend most federal dollars on programs that already had evidence of success. Now, in Washington, evidence can be a letter from a constituent. In fact, I could regale you with a 5-minute story about an experience I had with 7 members of the Black Caucus in the House of Representatives who told me that conclusions that we reached were totally wrong, and they knew it because and a member actually waved a letter from a constituent and said, "This is how we know the program worked." Well, that doesn't, and not so. You need good evidence, defined usually as random assignment, but in all of the initiatives, as you'll see in a minute, quasi-experimental designs, I don't know how many of you are researchers, but it doesn't have to meet the gold standard. It has to be at least quasi-experimental. So that most of the federal dollars would be spent on, not all, but most would be spent on programs that already had evidence of success. Now I can tell you, after being in Washington all these years, we have so many programs. I always think of Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is something like $15 billion now, that you hardly know what it was spent on, but it sure there's no requirement to be spent on anything that might actually have an impact. God forbid that you would require that the federal government spend its money on something that might do some good. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was continuous evaluation, that every program should be evaluated. Now, every program can't be evaluated with random assignment designs. It costs too much administrative trouble, takes too long, and so forth. But we could have good evidence, at least of outcomes, and good measures of outcomes. I think this is a whole area, I'm going to come back to this, where we have a lot to learn and a lot that we don't know the best way to do this. But we do need to evaluate every single program, and we need to know if they're producing the impacts that we want. And if they don't, we need to make some changes. Not necessarily by defunding the programs, and again, we'll come back to that. So this is straightforward. These are the 2 things that the Obama administration wanted to do, and it's almost shameful to say what radical ideas these were. You know, it makes such great sense, and if you talk to the American public and said, well, do you think we ought to spend our money on things that work? And they would look at you and say, what kind of question is that? You know, of course. And do you think that we should find out if the program's actually having its intended effect? And they'd have the same reaction. And yet this is radical in Washington. So I want to now tell you about how they did it. I want to make one point first that I think is a crucial part of what has to happen in Washington and has not happened yet. The original vision was that the administration was going to start working with programs that were already existent. And they were going to go back, so to speak, take my example, Title I, and they were going to change those programs so that they did have evidence. And they were going to insist that the money that had been going out the door for all these years would really change. Well, in Washington, those kind of changes almost never work. It's very difficult to do something like that. And I would have to, I put PART up there, that stands for Program Assessment Rating Tool. The Bush administration had actually tried to do something similar, and previous administrations had too. They were always, OMB especially, they're always trying to get the administrative agencies to focus on results and make sure you could have impacts and measure the impacts and so forth. So they came up with millions of schemes. PART was a very good one, made great sense and so forth. And part of it was that agencies had to evaluate their programs, which of course they did not do. So this part of the initiative, I'm sorry to report, failed utterly. But we do need to do this. We do, if we are able to be successful in creating federal evidence-based policy, and I'll call it a culture change, I'm going to come back to that, we are going to have to go back and make the Title I's of the world much more successful than they are now. And then, of course, the federal grants, which is what I would, new grants, and that's what this initiative consists of. So if you're going to have an evidence-based initiative, you have to think about what evidence is and what kind is acceptable. And I can't get into this deeply enough in this talk. I go into it in great detail in the book. But I think that this was part of the brilliance of the administration in defining evidence, because they couldn't make everything random assignment, so they had to compromise. And they did compromise with themselves and with the agencies. There were sometimes tension between the federal government and the agencies. And the decision was that we will have two general types of ways to define evidence. The first one is we'll do it ourselves. And this was part of the brilliance that I was referring to a minute ago. If you look in the book and elsewhere at home visiting and teen pregnancy prevention, the administration went through an elaborate, wonderful procedure that many social scientists go through when they do a meta-analysis or a literature review of deciding how many studies there were of this issue, what the outcomes were, what the quality of studies, a very systematic approach. And they came down to the list of programs that they would consider to be evidence-based. So that was one way to do it. The federal government would do it, and they would say to the country, if you want our money, we're going to spend 75% of our money on these programs, so you have to be using one of those programs. And then the other way to do it was to allow whoever's applying for the money to define what evidence means. So they would, in fact, do their own literature review, and they would come to the conclusion that this particular program is one that works. And many people came to the conclusion, this is kind of shocking, that the program that they've been running all these years is evidence-based. Why, golly, it sure is. And they would argue for that in their application, and then, of course, there'd be a review panel, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. So these are the two ways that evidence was defined. Now, I detest people who use slides like this, so I want to make a case for why this is in here. There are two slides in this presentation that I'm not going to talk much about, but I want them in the presentation because I'm sure you'll make them available on a website. So you can go back and look at these and really think about this. This is how the evidence requirement in each of the 6 initiatives, I'll talk about the initiatives in just a minute, were defined in the statutes or in the funding announcement, and often both. And of course, the funding announcement, according to the way we do government in Washington, has to be consistent with the statute, but often goes way beyond the statute and gives you details about what the statute really meant. In doing that, clever administrators can often completely change what the statute actually means. I've been involved in many cases like that. But so it's interesting. Look at the very first one, which is on home visiting. In order to be evidence-based, you have to bring significant positive outcomes from randomized controlled trials or quasi-experimental. This is actually in the statute. Experimental research designs. And then there's much more information in the funding announcement. The funding announcements are really, if you want to know about these initiatives, read the funding announcements. They're very important. And the home visiting statute is more detailed than most of the other programs, and that's because the Finance Committee and the staffers of the Finance Committee really got into this. It was really fun to watch this happen because I knew them on a personal basis. Finance Committee is more or less the sister committee of the Ways and Means Committee, Finance Committee in the Senate, Ways and Means Committee in the House. So I knew the staffers, and when we interviewed them, we found out lots of gory details about how they actually did this. And as often happens, Angela Evans here would know this, although she probably couldn't say it because she's from the Congressional Research Service, and they have to respect the Congress. But I'm on the outside. I don't have to respect the Congress. I do respect it, but they do a lot of weird things. And one of them is that they let staff run amok. And so these initiatives were really defined by staff. The members entered in certain crucial cases. I'll talk about one or two of those. But the staff really got into this and played a big role with the administration. And it was actually, I was surprised, it was a fairly harmonious thing. Keep in mind, this is 2009 when most of these passed. You might remember that was kind of an ugly year in Washington. Obama was just elected, and a lot of Republicans were already figuring out they didn't like Obama at all. See, I bring all this new information from Washington. And nonetheless, and especially the Finance Committee worked on a bipartisan basis, and all below the level of the members, the staffers are working together furiously, supported by their chairman. The chairman knew what was going on. They just didn't know the details, and it wouldn't help if they did because they couldn't contribute much. But anyway, it was really it was a wonderful thing to watch. And I want to mention one other thing, too, that is very interesting. If you were in Washington for a year and worked either in administration or on the Hill, you would find out that when there's a transition from one administration to the next, and to a large extent, it doesn't make any difference if it's Republican to Republican, Democrat to Democrat, or it's Republican and Democrat, that there is a lot of tension between career civil servants in the agencies and the political appointees. All administrations have top political appointees in the agencies, and they want their appointees to set the direction for the agency. And they're working on a day-to-day basis, right in the same building and offices with people who've been there for 20 years, who know everything. I mean, civil servants, a lot of them are super competent, and they know a lot. And so the administration is trying to impose a new agenda on them. It often turns out to be ugly. And these are all new things. And yet, the harmony between OMB, which could be called the most hated organization in Washington in some cases, and the agencies. So education, health and human services, labor, and something called the Corporation for National and Community Service. Those were the 4 administrative agencies that ran these 6 initiatives and helped develop them, and OMB worked hand in glove with them. It was, again, it was a thing of beauty that all these public officials were able to work together so smoothly. There were some fights, especially with the Department of Labor, but in the end, everything was resolved nicely, and we got these wonderful initiatives. So what are the 6 initiatives? I'm just going to say one word about them. First of all, very important, all new money, roughly around $5.3 billion, which is nothing in Washington. It's barely a footnote, asterisk. So here are the 6. Teen pregnancy prevention, which of all the initiatives, I would say was the one that had the most political support. Everybody thinks teens should not have babies. It was not always so in the United States, but now everybody agrees. Very popular. Nonetheless, Washington figured out a way to have big arguments, and the argument is about Republicans say the program should be abstinence only. And we should not make birth control available to these little kids. We should convince them they should not have sex. Well, any parents in the audience? I have 4 kids, 2 boys and 2 girls, 2 of each variety, and I gave them this message over and over again. They were sick of it. And I can say without fear of being wrong, it worked once out of 4 times. I had 1 kid with a conscience. The rest of them, you know. So abstinence only, I knew from the very beginning was not necessarily going to work, but back to your original impression of me, I was a head staffer, and we did this in welfare reform, and it was part of the welfare reform legislation. We gave the states money for abstinence only, defined with an infamous A through H definition that if you read it, you would freeze right on the spot. It's unbelievable. That sex is only acceptable between married couples. I mean, you wouldn't believe these definition of abstinence only. So Washington still fight about that. And I don't have time to go into it, but if you read the book, you will read a fascinating story about the compromise that they reached on teen pregnancy prevention that involved what everybody assumed was not going to happen because Democrats hated the abstinence only with a passion. And they knew they could kill it because they got the presidency, they got the House and the Senate, and yet the Finance Committee reached an agreement, and abstinence only lives on, and it's still going at 50 million a year. So home visiting, which we're going to talk about a lot today, so I won't say much about that. Invest in innovation, which is really a fascinating program at the Department of Education. I think it's about to die because, again, I'm bringing new information. Republicans don't like that guy Obama, and all these have the taint of Obama, so they're all at risk, in my opinion. One of them has already been killed. The Workforce Innovation Fund was killed by Republicans. And they tried to kill, the House actually did kill Invest in Innovation. And it is one of the most interesting programs because it's funding all kinds of evidence-based stuff in public education. We've had a revolution since 2000 in educational research. It used to be really junky. I can remember I was a graduate student in education. I have a Master of Arts in Teaching, and I once read the description of educational research that said, the vast wasteland of educational research. And that was true, I mean, really. But now we have all, and what happened is economists, they're guilty parties right in this very audience, invaded the territory of education and started doing actual research based on large populations and random assignment. And we've learned a lot, and we're going to learn even more if we can keep investing in innovation going. Social Innovation Fund, also very fascinating. We have lots of entrepreneurs around the country who are not interested in necessarily making money. They want to start new programs to save little kids. And so we actually have a group of people in the United States who are kind of intermediaries. And they look for people who are rich and try to get their money. And then they also look for these important local projects that are successful. Some of them have even been evaluated, mostly by letters from constituents. But and they try to bring them together to help them fund. And that's what this initiative does. The federal government gives the money to these intermediaries, there are 21 of them now, and they go out and look for the best programs, and they follow stipulated criteria, but they have a lot of flexibility. And so this is funding small organizations, usually small organizations around the country. And then the trade adjustment systems and workforce innovation, I'm not going to talk about it. Workforce innovation has been killed, but fortunately the way the statute works, they got enough to keep it going for, I think, 4 or 5 years. So we're going to, and they're doing some wonderful evaluations, which traditionally have not been notable in the whole area of employment and training. So I think we're going to learn some good stuff, and I'm looking forward to seeing these results. So those are the 6 initiatives. Now, I'm going to talk about culture change. I'll come to it in more detail in a minute. How long can I talk? The audience is disagreeing with you. They're getting fed up right now. Another 30 seconds.
No, we have this panel goes until 10:15.
Okay. All right. Okay. I'm going to leave at least 20 minutes for question. That makes sense? All right. So if you're going to change the United States, it's going to take a lot of projects at the state level, at the local level, and so forth. So it turns out that there are 1,400 programs being funded across these 6 initiatives. Fortunately, I did not put a table like this in the book because my old table said 700. And the reason it said 700 is that the biggest initiative by far is home visiting. And nobody had a count. We talked to everybody we could think of. We couldn't get a count. But every state, or at that time, 48 states ran a program. So we used 48. Well, someone has now made a count, 770 some in the United States. So that's how we get to 1,400. So now think about this. I've told you what these initiatives are like. The goal is clearly to change the way we do business and funding programs and the way we conduct social interventions. And there are now 1,400 of these programs all around the country. They're in every state. And they are trying to emphasize Start with evidence-based program or something innovative, I'll come to that in a few minutes, and evaluate. And with high-quality designs, random assignment is best. So the question before us is, can we expect that this really is going to change the way we do business, and that the states are going to pick it up, and local government's going to get on board, and evidence-based is going to become, it's already a term that everybody uses, but they use it for a lot of junk. So we got to tighten things up. And so the question is, with these 1,400 programs, and maybe I think the Head Start is another example of what the administration is doing now with Head Start, and there's a new initiative in education that I haven't had time to study very carefully, but it also follows these same general approaches. And maybe we'll get more in the future. So the question is, are we really going to be able to parlay that into a big change in the way we do policy? So I'm going to talk just a few more minutes about the long term and the characteristics of the Obama approach that I hope become characteristics of policy in the future. So let's begin with RCTs. It's very important not to be doctrinaire about RCTs. I know a lot of people who are really doctrinaire, and they reject all evidence unless it's from an RCT, randomized controlled trial. The essence of a randomized controlled trial, we have a long history. I start the book with Daniel in the Old Testament because Daniel was captured by Nebuchadnezzar, and he was going to serve the king. I think he was going to interpret his dreams, if you can believe that. And so the king wanted him to feed him well. And so he was supposed to eat from the king's table. But Daniel refused to do it because he thought they should eat vegetables. He might have been the first vegetarian, I don't know. But so the king, the chamberlain he's called, that was in charge of all the slaves, came to Daniel and said, you got to eat, because if you don't, the king is going to do something bad to me, like cut my head off. So they reached a compromise, and Daniel suggested that they do an experiment. This is in, like 2000 BC. And the idea was that we'll have a group that's going to eat from the king's table, and we'll have a group that eats the vegetables, and let's see how healthy they are. And the answer in the Bible was that the group that ate the vegetables looked every bit as good. It actually, in some versions, uses the word they were fatter than the ones eating from the king's table. I'm not sure that would work today, but anyway, so this idea of, actually, let's not stand and argue, let's find out. Let's do an organized experiment. And the beauty of random assignment is that in order to really conclude that the experimental group differs from the control group, you have to be sure they were the same in the beginning. And the only way to do that, known to man or God, is to randomly assign them. Now, isn't that strange? That you randomly assign people, and that's the only known way to make sure the groups are identical in the beginning. They will differ. They will differ in ways maybe that we can't even measure. But however they differ, it will be equally represented in the groups by the logic of random assignment. So there will be people in one group that differ, they're way out on the fringe of characteristic A, but there'll be a person like that in group B as well. So random assignment is crucial, but it's very difficult, it's expensive, and the random assignment studies tend to take a long time, especially the way we've been doing them in the United States, often 3 or 4 years. And we can't operate programs on that basis. So we have to, I love random assignment. I think it should have a great place, but it can't be universal. And one of the reasons that we have to have it, there's a wonderful book that I could not recommend any book more than this if you're interested in this general area. And it's called Uncontrolled, written by Jim Manzi, who's a businessman. And Jim Manzi has made a fortune. You know how he did it? Conducting random assignment experiments for businesses to improve their bottom line. So my favorite example is that old Manzi he has contracts with something like 50 of the biggest corporations in the world. And he has, one of his clients is Subway. So one of the Subway franchises in California, the guy gets a bright idea of a $5 footlong. You ever hear that? And the president of Subway didn't like it because he figures they're never going to make a profit. So he calls Manzi and says, Manzi, well, how do we figure this out? So they did a random assignment experiment. It wasn't people, it was franchises, and they randomly assigned franchises. They already had all the data because they're regularly reporting you know, how much they sold and the profits and all that. Well, it turns out that just as the president predicted, the franchises that used the $5 footlong did not make as much money on the $5 footlongs. So you would think, see, they shouldn't do it. Well, guess what? They got more people in the store, and they bought Cokes and potato chips and so forth, and especially Cokes. Yeah, I know every Subway I've been in, they have both bottles, but they also have the, what do you call those, you know, where you, the machine. What do you? Fountain, well, whatever you call it. And that's almost pure profit. So the ones that had the $5 footlong lost on the sandwiches, but they more than made up for it, and their bottom line was significantly better than the rest of it. So they changed their practice. And Manzi's worked with many companies to do that. And Manzi turns out to be a brilliant genius. He has a degree in physics from MIT or something like that. So he writes this book that is just a fabulous book, Uncontrolled. And in there he introduces, I never heard of this before, causal density. Now, it seems like a funny term, but what it means is that for humans, there's never a single cause. There are 50 causes, and they interact in complicated ways. That's why you have to have random assignment. We're not going to be able to lay out in great detail, especially for behavioral things. For some physical conditions, you can do this, medical conditions, but for behavioral things, it's very difficult. And there are 5 or 10 or 15 causes, but some of them are really important, and if you could manipulate those, then you can change behavior. And that's why we need random assignment. So there's a great justification. Humans are complex, and just because a program works in Norfolk, as Manzi says in the book, doesn't mean it's going to work in Spearfish, South Dakota. And that's why we have to have random assignment to figure out what works in every setting. Modest impacts, that's another. We are afflicted in behavioral research because most of our impacts are quite modest. We do not get huge impacts. So my mantra for people is always cherish modest impacts, because most people don't get impacts at all. And that's another thing we found out from random assignment studies, is that most things don't work. It's a very discouraging thing, but it's true. Most programs don't work. Even in business and in medical research and in social science research, roughly 80 or 90% of the programs that have been developed and are subjected to careful random assignment studies are shown to fail or produce a very modest impact. So we're going to have modest impacts mostly, and we need to learn to build on those and make them even more successful. But if we get a modest impacts on a large scale, any of you who are familiar with the logic of public health, you could make a big, big difference if you can have this on a huge scale. Another problem with random assignment, of course, is expense. I've talked about this several times. It often takes a long time. It's very expensive. And there are kind of human problems in some cases. When you withhold a treatment, people get mad, even though if you don't know for sure, you're withholding a treatment that works. So there have been a lot of colorful episodes in having control groups, and citizens don't like control groups. And that leads to the question of whether RCTs are ethical. So RCT is a big part of the issue here. It's problematic. It is, I think it will always play an important role, but we need more than RCTs, that's for sure. We're going to need quasi-experimental studies, and even one kind of study that I'll talk about in just a minute. It's neither of those. So why did the Obama initiatives work? Notice that I'm begging a big question here. I think they worked, and so I'm asserting they are, and if any of you don't agree with that, I'd love to hear what you have to say when we get to question and answer. First, I've already suggested this in several cases, stellar leadership. The administration had a ton of people on the Council of Economic Advisors, in the White House, at OMB, and in the executive agencies that had experience with research, that already knew the logic for random assignment, and that jumped right on board. They were only too anxious to do it, and that made a huge difference, starting all the way, as I said before, at the top with Peter Orszag. Second, as you might imagine, a relentless focus on using evidence. That was clear from the beginning. It was like they were robots. Everybody in administration, evidence, 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 evaluation, evaluation. They all sing in the same tune. You would be surprised how many times, even in big initiatives in Washington, that the administration does not agree within itself. And this causes lots of troubles. You see it on the Hill all the time, too. But if you have a disciplined team of smart people who know what they're doing and they're all singing the same tune, it makes a huge difference. And Obama achieved that. I mentioned legislative strategies. They were very, very clever with the legislation. First of all, as I told you, this is an obvious strategy that often works in Washington, which is if you have a provision that's little, defined as less than 50 trillion, you try to stick it in another bill and don't call attention to it. Now, this is not exactly in accord with democratic principles. Members ought to know what they're voting for, but they don't. And so if you can put this in a big bill, it'll pass and no one will even notice it, except the chairman of the committee. So you got to have their permission, and usually the leadership too, at least of your own party. And if you try to get away with sticking something in, and we had a recent example of this, and you get caught, that's a big problem. So you got to at least tell the leadership what's in there. And so normally what happens is that people who write the bill brief the staff of the leadership in detail, and then the members tell in the big, broad terms what's in the bill. So that was one thing that they did. So they passed the home visiting, I've already said, was passed in Obamacare, which was a monster piece of legislation, more than 1,000 pages. I think, in fact, it was more than 2,000 pages. One of them was passed on a huge reconciliation bill, and so forth. So that, and whenever they got in trouble on the Hill, someone important in administration, including in 2 cases, Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff to the president at that time, intervened and would call a member, call the chairman. And one case, I'm almost sure, went up there and met with him. So the administration was really committed to these, and they got good leadership and good legislative strategies. And I hope you've noticed this whole thing is not going to work if we have formula grants. Formula grants, we spend a lot of money, like Title I again. I hate to keep picking on Title I, but you get it by virtue of the fact that you're a state with a certain number of people, or you have a certain share of the poverty population or whatever. So there's no competition. You cannot be denied the money. And guess what? Politicians love that. They want to spread the money around. That's their mantra. They want everybody to get something because they're going to run for office, and they want to make sure that they've done things for people. But if you want to get people who want the money to sing your tune, then you need to make it competitive. So all of the Obama initiatives are competitive in that sense. You have to apply, and you're competing with others, and you have to do at minimum what the request for proposal was asking you to do. So competitive is crucial. And then decent review panels. I want to be cautious about this. I've been on review panels myself. I bet there are people in this room who have been on review panels. I've been on 4 review panels, and one of them was really, it bothered me a lot because it was a lousy panel. And it was a lousy panel because it was dominated by one individual. It was a fairly small panel. I think there were 8 people. And we just flat made the wrong decision. This is very important. I'm not going to say what it was, but it was very important. It was established a new center with federal dollars, and we picked the wrong one, I think, because one person dominated the panel. I'm really nervous about review panels. On the other hand, I can't think of a better way to do it. It's consistent with democratic government. It's consistent with our emphasis in many cases on expertise. So the secretary tries to pick a really impressive group of researchers and administrators, and they carefully go through the grants, and then they discuss it among themselves, and they send a priority list to the secretary. That's the way it usually works. Now, the secretary has authority to override the list. He doesn't have to follow the list, and sometimes makes changes, but that's politically dangerous. And in one of these initiatives, let's see, the one involved the Corporation for National and Community Service, Social Innovation Fund, actually did this in a round and did not follow the recommendation of their panels, and it made the New York Times. So a lot of discussion about favoritism and all that kind of stuff. So there are a lot of dangers here, but review panels, even though I can't think of a better way, it makes me nervous that because the money has to go out to the door to organizations that are effective and have a track record of being successful, and they're using programs that have strong evidence of success. If you don't have that, then the initiative is not going to work. So review panels put a big question mark by them. Now, how are we going to know if this is successful? The first thing is that they survived. We've already lost a little bit of the 2015 test because the Workforce Innovation Fund was killed by the Congress. And we could this year lose the educational, the I3 so-called, investing in innovation, which would be a huge shame. Republicans just don't like it. They've already killed it once in the House. It was rescued by the Democratic Senate, but now we don't have a Democratic Senate to rescue it. So a lot of people think that it could die this year. And then if we got a Republican president in 2017, even within the same party, presidents want their own agendas, and especially given how tight money is in Washington, they might have to at least reduce, probably wouldn't kill it, but cut way back on something so they could use the money for something else. So this is going to be a big test in 2017. By the way, just yesterday, the Senate, the day before yesterday, the Senate passed legislation on something called SGR, which is a huge issue, the rate of reimbursement for doctors in the Medicare program. And that had the home visiting extension, 2-year extension of home visiting, which is $400 million a year, which in Washington's not much, but it's a big deal in these initiatives. And it's for 2 years, so $800 million passed. So at least I am breathing a little easier about home visiting, which I think in many respects is the most interesting initiative. So that's going to last at least 2 more years, but there's good reason to think it would be tough after that. Early positive outcomes. Now, I told you, 1,400 programs going on around the country. Just by, even if a lot of them fail, there will be some successes. There need to be some successes. Members who want to support this, and advocates and parents, whoever wants to get in on the act and try to lobby for this legislation and make sure it's consistently renewed, they need to be able to point to some successes. Now, we know there are going to be a lot of failures. In fact, 2016 is going to be a big year, because there are going to be a lot of good evaluations that start being reported out, including national evaluations of these programs. And some there's more evaluation going on than we've ever had in the United States, I think, for these programs, especially home visiting and teen pregnancy. And both have national evaluations as well as evaluations of scores of local programs. So there have to be some successes. But there are going to be failures. And this is another crucial point. What do we do when an initiative fails? You're going to find out here in Texas, because you're going to start getting results in home visiting and other things too, but home visiting is the focus of today's event. There will be a lot of programs that don't produce good outcomes. So what do? Defund them? No, we can't do that. What we have to do is send a message: you have to fail to succeed. As long as you are using the results of evaluation and other means of collecting information from parents, from teachers, testing of the kids and so forth, and you're making changes in your program and testing further, that is the strategy. That's what we want. We want a continuous improvement, emphasis on outcomes. This is the culture that we need to establish. And in doing so, we're going to have a lot of failure. So we can't let failure stop us. And especially, this is the reason that in many cases, program operators have never liked evaluation, because they know their programs work. They know. They've got letters from constituents. And besides that, they and their staff did it, so of course it worked. But then when you evaluate for the first time and you find out that they're modest effects and they're gone within 6 months, they don't like that. I wouldn't like that. You wouldn't like that. But that's the way the world is. So we've got to learn to have better, more effective interventions. And to do that, we have to develop a culture of learning from failure and continuing to try to experiment using the results of evaluation. All right, so major issues that are remaining, and then we can take questions. The role of RCTs, I've said enough about that already. When a program fails, what's next? We've talked about that. Innovation versus evidence. I just want to say a few words about this. The logic of this approach, and let me start with this. I am on the board of a spectacular organization in Washington called the Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy. And one of the things that the coalition does is they have groups of experts, and we review social science studies. And on the website, if you Google Coalition for Evidence-Based Policy, on the very first page that comes up, you'll see a thing on the evidence-based initiatives. Do you know how many programs we have identified in something like 5 years that meet the highest standards or the next highest? So top, called top tier, or near top tier. Of all social science programs, 22. 22 that meet the highest standards, and not even the highest standards, several of them are near top tier. Well, we are not going to change the country on the basis of 22 programs. We need 122 or 222. So that means we need innovation. We need people out there in the countryside, like these innovators in the SIF, the Social Innovation Fund, that are constantly trying new things, trying to develop new curricula, trying to develop new approaches with parents and with kids, maybe liaison with the schools, who knows. And then we need to test them. That's a part of the culture, constantly developing new things and testing them to find out if they work. And hopefully we'll have lots of websites that tell people who want to run a program that if you use this program as opposed to that program, you're going to be able to produce impacts. So innovation has to be a part of this. And eventually, after lots of political struggle, the administration worked it out so that innovation is a part of all 6 of the initiatives. Some of the money is spent on programs that are promising, but aren't necessarily supported even by quasi-experimental design. Implementation. Everybody knows about implementation. I'm convinced, after looking at this carefully now for 4 years, that we know far too little about implementation. We can develop programs. We've developed a lot of good programs, but how do you make them work in 100 places? And think about this. Head Start, thousands of centers. Any national program for a national problem, teen pregnancy, whatever, we're going to have thousands of sites. And so you have to implement with local people, directors and teachers or whoever's involved, and parents, and the conditions vary, the amount of money varies, everything varies. So how do we implement this good model program in 1,000 places around the country? We don't know nearly enough about that. So and a lot of people are working on it. I think we're going to learn a lot. We're going to learn a lot here in Texas, I hope, if you do your job right. We're going to learn about, here are the 4 things you have to do if you're going to have a successful home visiting program. So you might be able to vary these a little bit from location to location, but you got to have these 4 things. So good model programs. So I am convinced, after studying this thing carefully, and there's certain buy-in when you study something like this, but I went to Washington to figure out the role of innovation in social policy, the role of evidence in social policy, and this is by far the most important, most successful, with the broadest application use of social science evidence that I have ever encountered. The public pays for social science. The public pays for social science. We owe the public the gratitude of showing that we can develop things that work and implement things that work. And this is the best way we thought of doing it. So if this grows, we're going to be meeting our responsibility in a much more fulsome way. Thank you. Questions?